One woman tells of a conversation that she had with her granddaughter. She says, out bicycling one day with my 8-year-old granddaughter, Carolyn, I got a little wistful. In 10 years, I said, you'll want to be with your friends, and you won't go walking, biking, and swimming with me like you do now. Carolyn shrugged. In 10 years, you'll be too old to do all those things anyway. You know, it's true that our relationships must change with the passage of time. Relationships don't stand still. And it would be good if they changed for the better, if our relationships just kept getting more better, if we matured in our relationships, and if we grew closer together. But too often we've seen those relationships in our lives slipping away, shrinking with the passage of time. I'll admit to you this morning that I had many close friends in high school and in college, people that were like brothers and sisters to me at the time, that I would have a hard time saying where they're located now and whether or not they're married, whether they have kids and what the names of their kids might be. Over the years and over the decades, I've simply lost touch with a lot of people that I was once very close to. I think it's sort of sad that relationships sometimes can slip away. But it's not nearly as tragic as if we allow our relationship with God to become cold. As we come to our text this morning, we're going to continue in our messages from 1 Samuel. As we come to our text, we find Israel trying to recover from their lapse in their relationship with God. Our text this morning, 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. There we find these words. And the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill, and consecrated Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. From the day that the ark remained at Kiriath Jearim, the time was long, for it was 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord with all your heart, remove the foreign gods and the Asherah from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord, and serve him alone, he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashereth, and served the Lord alone. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. They gathered to Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day, and said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the sons of Israel at Mizpah. Now, when the Philistines heard that the sons of Israel had gathered to Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the sons of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. Then the sons of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it for a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried to the Lord for Israel, and God answered him. Now Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, and the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day against the Philistines, and confused them, so that they were routed before Israel. The men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far as below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more within the border of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron even to Gath. And Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines. So there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. So we look at this text this morning. I want you to think, first of all, that phrase, I am his. What does it mean to be in a relationship with God? What made it possible for Israel to be God's people? I want to say to you this morning that it was not merely the blood which flowed in their veins, the blood that they had in common with their ancestor Abraham. Simply because they were Abraham's descendants did not mean that they were God's people. They were physically qualified to be his people when God allowed the enemy to prevail over them. And when he brought the severe condemnation on them at the return of the ark, they were even then physically qualified to be his people. But he was not recognizing them as his people on those occasions. No, they had not been his people because they lacked commitment to him. And so Samuel, as they come out to repent of their sins, as they pour water on the ground to indicate that they're pouring out their lives for the Lord, they're admitting the wrong that they have done for him, they're asking for him to renew his commitment to them. So Samuel tells them that they need to return to God. Their former neglect of God and their worship of foreign gods had distanced themselves from God. I want you to see the context of this passage. Samuel is speaking to them here 20 years after the ark had been returned to Israel. 20 years after they had left the ark in a remote place in the kingdom because they were afraid of their Lord. 20 years now have passed since our message last week. I know sometimes it seems like I'm up here for 20 years. But 20 years has passed since the events of last week's message to the events of this week's message. And all that time, the Ark of the Covenant had sat in a remote place in the land because God was not tolerant of their waywardness. And so they felt better off by pushing God far away, by keeping him at a great distance from them. They felt safer having a God who was not part of their daily lives and removing themselves from his presence. But you know, that was no solution either. They might have felt safer living the lifestyle that they wanted to live far away from God. But they needed God. Consider their situation here. The land that Israel called their own was a land that God had delivered into their hands. They had fought against armies that were superior in weaponry and superior in number. They had gone up against fortified cities. These descendants of slaves had bested some of the best armies in the world at the time because God was with them. And even now that they possess this land that God had cleared for them, they do so by God's favor. Israel's surrounded by enemies. The nations around them are much more mighty than Israel. And when God is not with them, those nations feel free to pick on Israel as much as they want, to make Israel pay tribute to them, to come and take whatever they want to from Israel, and even to take lands and cities away from Israel. They could have destroyed Israel altogether in that time if God was not with them. If God was not with them, Israel could not have stood any longer. But that's not the only reason they needed God. Do you notice what kind of people they become when they push God away? They become less human. They become more like their worldly neighbors. They start worshiping the foreign gods. They start observing the kinds of things that were done to those evil gods. They start participating in the worship of Baal, which included the sacrifice of children to fire so that they could have a better harvest. And sexual celebrations in worship of their gods. And the people of Israel, as they left God behind, as they pushed God off to one side, they became more selfish and less kind and less considerate and less willing to do for others. Their land became a crueler, more selfish, more degrading kingdom with God's absence. And that meant that they were less human. Their return to God was absolutely necessary. And Samuel says here in this passage, their return to God must be with all their heart. They could not live with contradictions in their relationship with God. They could not live with contradictions even on the inside, even in those areas of their lives that they're keeping hidden from others. They can't live with those glaring contradictions to God. They had to return to God with all of their person. They could not merely add God on with the other interests they had, interests that often conflicted with their desire to live for him. In order to do what they needed to do, they had to remove the foreign gods and the Asherah from among themselves. That means they had to level the temples of Baal. They had to take down the Asherah poles from the high places. They had to remove altogether every trace of worship of any other than God in their land. God would not be worshiped alongside the other gods. But it wasn't just what they needed to destroy. It's also what they needed to have built. I talked a number of years ago with a man who was conducting a mission to rescue Mormons. He was involved heavily in showing them the error of the teachings of the Book of Mormon and of the practice of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And he said, during that time I thought it was enough to refute the things that the Mormons taught. He said, but the mistake I was making is I was making them to live in a much worse condition than they were before I delivered them. Because I had taken away their faith in Mormonism and hadn't replaced it with anything else. And these people didn't have an anchor for their lives anymore. He said, I understood from that time on that if I was going to tear down the false things, I needed to build up the truth. They needed to come and see who God was and to have a relationship with him, or what I was doing was destructive and not helpful to him. The Israelites could not just tear down what they had been doing before. They also needed to build up. And so Samuel instructs the Israelites that they need to direct their hearts to the Lord. They need to give him the place that they had given the lies before. They were to serve God, Samuel says, alone. Now, I put the emphasis on the word alone there, but that's already been covered, hasn't it? I want you to see the emphasis on another word in that phrase. They were to serve God alone. Notice here, it wasn't just what they believed or how they worshiped that was the issue. If they were God's people, they needed to serve God. And I'm reminded of this, that real faith is always translated into action. Faith is a noun that must become a verb. It must be lived to change what they did and say, and not just what they believed privately. They couldn't just flip a switch in their beliefs and be right with God. They needed to live for him in their daily lives. And if we would be his today, the same things must be true for us as well. We are his not just because our parents were, not just because we attend church, not just because our names may be in the church records, or that sometime in our lives we made a profession of faith and obeyed him in baptism. These things speak more of the opportunity to be his people than whether we are truly his. Those who are truly God's won't keep God at a distance. they won't reserve their life from him. To be his means that we won't reserve any part of our heart from him. To belong to him means removing all allegiances which would compromise our commitment to him and him alone. To be his means we deliberately seek him and nurture our commitment to him from the heart. And to be his means that we serve him with our lives. Start off with that phrase, I am his. Now the complementary phrase, and he is mine. As Israel was gathered at Mizpah, the Philistines decided to gather against them. The Philistines were coming up against them with great force, superior numbers, superior armament, superior weapons. The Philistines had defeated Israel at will in the past, and they were together again now that they heard that Israel was gathered at Mizpah to deal them a fatal blow. And when Israel saw that powerful enemy had come to destroy them, they were afraid. In their recent lives, God had not stood with them against this enemy. Even when they tried to drag God into the fight, even when they brought the Ark of the Covenant onto the battlefield, God had allowed their enemies to triumph over them. And just now they had assembled to come back to God. Just now they had pledged that they would be his people. But would God acknowledge that? Would God now stand with them? The people pleaded that Samuel would continue to call on God in their behalf, and so Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered up a burnt offering to God, calling upon God to deliver his people from the hands of the Philistines. And even as Samuel was making that sacrifice, God intervened in a powerful way. He brought a great noise like thunder against the Philistines that so frightened them, so terrorized them, that they were left dazed and confused and easy prey for the Israelites, who had a great victory against them on that day. Israel had a great victory because God was on their side. Even as they had pledged that they would be his people, God was their God. And as long as Samuel led them, we're told in this passage, and as long as the people continued walking with the Lord, the Philistines never attempted to raid the Israelites again. Even more, all the cities and all the lands that the Philistines had conquered were returned to Israel once again because Israel had a partnership with God. Brothers and sisters, I want to tell you this morning, we don't need to worry that our God will be committed to us if we are truly his. If we place ourselves in his keeping, if we acknowledge that he is our God, if we try to serve him from the heart, we can be sure God will do his part. When God goes with us, no obstacle before us can overwhelm us. There's nothing that you face in your daily life. There's no extreme circumstance that comes into your life that you cannot face if God's on your side. In conclusion this morning, this 20 years that Israel had been keeping the Ark of the Covenant in a remote place, this 20 years that Israel had been deliberately distancing themselves from their God, do you see what our passage says about that 20 years? It says, all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. It was their fault God was far away. They had pushed God away. But that didn't mean that they didn't feel the lack of him in their lives. They were poorer and they knew it without their God in their lives. You may have wandered far from God. You may have allowed yourself to become distant from him. You might be keeping yourself from having a real relationship with him, one which touches you in your inner person. Oh, we can go through the motions of having a faith. We're pretty good at play acting sometimes, our devotion to the Lord. But it could be in your heart that you've been keeping far away from God. But I bet you can appreciate how unsatisfying it is to be distant from him. And if you're willing, you can return to God. You can determine to be his and to know that he is yours. If you want God to be on your side, then you need to be his person in truth and not just in name. If you want to be near to him, we have an opportunity for you to make that decision this morning, whether it's for the first time or whether you'd like to renew your commitment to the Lord. But if this morning you'd like to make Jesus Christ the Lord of your life and walk with God and to know that you're on his side and he's on your side, we ask that you'd come forward as we stand and sing our invitation song, Now I Belong to Jesus. Page 170 in your hymnal is also going to be up on the screen.